William Robinson, it's a pleasure to meet you. We're here at UC Santa Barbara, where you are a professor of sociology. Is that correct?
Sociology, Global Studies, and Latin American Studies.
I've been reading your book, Global Capitalism and the Crisis for Humanity, and I just want to read a few sentences from your book, and then we could go from there. Okay. So in the introduction, you say, "Our world is burning. We face a global crisis that is unprecedented in terms of its magnitude, its global reach, the extent of ecological degradation and social deterioration, and the scale of the means of violence. This is a time of great upheavals, momentous changes, and uncertain outcomes, fraught with dangers, including the very real possibility of collapse, as well as the growing threat of repressive social control systems that serve to contain the explosive contradictions of a global capitalism in crisis." And so I'm wondering if you can sort of explain some of the things that we see in our day-to-day lives, and people see in their lives around the world, that are sort of the impacts of this crisis. And then we can talk about what and who is causing the crisis, and maybe after that, how we can
What we can do about it.
do something about
Right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So let's look at the different dimensions of this crisis, and let's look at the impact that this has on people all around the world. But then later on, I would want to come back and point out that underlying all of these different dimensions of crisis is the capitalist system itself, its exhaustion, right? So we all know we're facing an existential crisis. We're an ecological collapse, an ecological holocaust is already underway, and so the biosphere is being destroyed. That, to begin with, is a crisis, of course, for humanity, but it's also a crisis for all living organisms on the planet. But we're a second dimension of the crisis. Well, let me put it like this. The crisis of global capitalism involves, for me, two key dimensions in addition to the ecological. The ecological is part of the story. It's impossible to separate this out. But we can say that the capitalist system is facing a structural crisis, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, and it's facing a crisis of legitimacy or of hegemony. And let's start with the structural crisis. And what do I mean by that? Well, inequalities worldwide have never been higher than they are now. A lot of people are familiar with the most recent data we have. 1% of humanity controls over 50% of the world's wealth.
So to ground that in people's daily lives, they're seeing a decrease in their purchasing power, a decrease in their wealth.
But just more than, right. But more than that, this is the other 20% of humanity controls 95% of the world's wealth. That means that 80% of humanity has only 5% of the world's wealth. Now, that means two things. In terms of people's daily existence, it means that a mass of billions of people are thrust out of the global economy, are locked out of any type of prosperity, and face daily struggles just for survival. What we call more technically in sociology, struggles just around issues of social reproduction. How do you get by from one day to the next? And I'll go into that in just a moment. But I want to point out the structural consequences, because it's very important to understand the world we're living in and why it's in crisis and what we can do about it. But in order to do that, we need to step back momentarily and make some analytical statements and even some theoretical perspective. So when we have 1% of humanity consuming 50% of the world's wealth, and that 20% being able to purchase, to exist, consuming 95% of the world's wealth, that means that increasingly a vast majority of humanity cannot consume. But this takes place at a time when the global economy, this global capitalist economy, is churning out more and more wealth than we've ever known. In 2020, the global economy has the ability to produce these massive amounts of wealth. Really, there's no material reason why we should have poverty whatsoever, any type of material suffering on the planet. But what does it mean when 80% cannot consume? It means that the global economy pours out all of this wealth and it cannot be absorbed by the global market. And when you have a situation like that, more technical terms, we say this is a crisis of overaccumulation. But what does it mean? It means that the global economy enters into a period of stagnation, prolonged stagnation, recessions, even depressions, and we are headed towards a bigger crisis in 2008. That's very clear. And you're doing this interview precisely when the coronavirus is really the trigger for the beginnings of a new recession, and we don't know just how serious it will be. So global capitalism faced this deep structural crisis, right, of not being able to, of falling into stagnation and not being able to reproduce itself, a structural crisis that we call overaccumulation. Why do we call overaccumulation? Because capital, corporations, have accumulated all of this wealth, all of this incredible profit. And in order for capitalism to continue to exist, that profit has to constantly be reinvested and come back as more and more profit. Capitalism constantly has to expand outward. Corporations and capitalists constantly have to reinvest and make more and more profit. If they're not able to do so, the system enters into this stagnation and a crisis of overaccumulating, meaning that the capital system and the capitalist class has accumulated so much wealth that it cannot continue to accumulate. And so that's the structural dimension. And it's very dangerous because when we see the structural crisis, it raises political tensions and interstate tensions and geopolitical tensions, and very often in the history of world capitalism leads to war. And war at this time, with the means of destruction being so vast, a new round of nuclear weapons production, including very small-scale nuclear weapons, when you wouldn't produce that if you weren't intending to use it. So we're living in very dangerous times in terms of geopolitics, the threat of war, worldwide conflicts, and of course, the biggest conflict of all, which is a global class and social conflict between the vast majority of have-nots and a tiny and shrinking minority of haves. Okay, so that's the structural dimension. And I want to again, most people don't think in these terms of analysis, even theoretical, historical perspective, but if we really want to get a grip of where we are at in 2020 and how humanity can pull itself out of this crisis, we need to go into some of this background. So let me say something about the nature of the capitalist system. And it's interesting, we're living at a time when, once again, the increasingly majority of the world's population rejects capitalism, and socialism is back on the agenda, including in the US elections. But let's understand something about capitalism. It's not that capitalists are inherently evil people and they want to have social polarization, and they want to get themselves rich at the expense of everyone else becoming impoverished. But that is the very nature of how capitalism functions. It generates tremendous amount of wealth. So far, it's one of the most productive, remarkably productive systems humanity has ever had in terms of increasing the forces of production, the ability to produce all of this wealth. But it inherently polarizes that wealth. It inherently leads to the rich getting richer, capital accumulating more, and the masses becoming dispossessed. And that inherently leads to crisis, which is why we say capitalism left to its own devices will produce crises of more and more severity and intensity. So you might ask, well, why has capitalism not ended in the last few hundred years, given all of these, inherent nature of it being crisis-ridden? And it's because, well, because there have been mass social and class struggles throughout the world over the decades and over the centuries of capitalism. But in particular, let's focus on what happened in the 20th century. The 20th century, particularly, there was the Great Depression, and the Great Depression unleashed a wave of mass struggles worldwide. In the United States, we had an upsurge of mass socialist struggles, communist movement struggles, trade union and worker struggles. This was in the United States in the 1930s. But worldwide, we had struggles against Western colonialism and for national liberation, and populist struggles all over the world. This forced on the capitalist system in the post-World War II period, which was a time of also dramatic advances in productivity and in the economy. But this forced a redistribution downward of that wealth at the level of the nation state. It's very important to understand. So in the United States, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. All over the world, rich are getting richer and poor are getting poorer. But these mass struggles all over the world that took place in the first half, actually right until the 1970s of the 20th century, forced at the level of the nation states, forced states to intervene in the economy to redistribute wealth in a more egalitarian form. Minimum wages, public pensions and social security, public health programs and expansion of public education, welfare benefits, unemployment benefits. One or another way, all over the world, we saw the states intervening in the capitalist market and the capitalist economy to attenuate this crisis by redistributing wealth downward with many different mechanisms.
So in the United States, this was like FDR's New Deal.
That's the beginning exactly of this new type of capitalism, which involves some element of state intervention and redistribution downward. The other thing that forced a redistribution downward at the nation-state level, right, is that workers fought against corporations, against bosses, against the capitalists, and forced the capitalists to make a series of concessions, wage concessions, job stability, etc. So this is what we had in the mid-20th century. But here's the key thing. Two things. One, that's not the whole history of capitalism. That was a moment, just a moment of a few decades in the mid-20th century, right? But the biggest thing that happened is that capital, and when I say capital, I'm referring to the capitalist class and the logic of the system. So capital felt very constrained at the level of the nation state when you get into the late 1960s, the 1970s, and into the 1980s, because you have a state intervening to restrict what corporations can do, right? I mean, and there's also other dimensions of that restrictions, which is environmental regulations, worker rights, safety and health and safety provisions.
So regulatory agencies.
Regulatory agencies.
Corporations eventually lobby against and try to get deregulated.
Exactly. But why were they able to achieve this in the latter 2 decades of the 20th century and now right up until 2020? Why were they able to reverse all of this and impose a new form of savage globalized capitalism, dismantling the welfare state, attacking workers, busting up unions, reorganizing the very work people do, throwing 2-3 billion people into marginality? Well, what's going on here is that capital felt very restricted at the level of the nation state. And so they had to get out of the nation state and to weaken the working and popular classes all over the world. By doing that, they went global and launched globalization.
So some of these big trade deals that we've seen, like NAFTA and the TPP and things like that.
All of that, everything involved with deregulation. So all of these trade deals say that capital can move across borders with no restriction whatsoever. Okay, that capital can invest and do whatever it wants with no regulation, lift environmental regulations, lift the trade union and worker rights, no longer any minimum wages, set up free trade zones where even the laws of a country don't apply in free trade zones.
Yeah, I remember seeing a documentary where in India, there was, I think it was a German corporation in this particular case, but they were talking about how they love to do business in India because they can pollute as much as they want.
Exactly.
And they were just blatantly saying that. And then they showed this river and it was disgusting. It was awful. And there's people living on it.
Precisely, but that's not isolated, right? That's taking place in India. But so let's look at what happens with this, because this is a movement, a downward pressure on environmental integrity, environmental regulations worldwide. India is just you see that so blatantly in India. But what happens is when capital goes global, first of all, it concentrates. So you have a handful of global corporations controlling like 60, 70, 80% of the global economy. They become incredibly powerful, but they're globalized now. So capital, for instance, right here in California, right here in the United States, we've seen this, threatens workers. If you don't take a pay cut, if the state doesn't give up, these guarantees and so forth, we simply relocate to low-wage zones. And of course, everyone knows that's what's been taking place. Capital in what were the rich countries, the industrialized countries, have already relocated to China and beyond China, Indonesia and Vietnam, to Mexico and beyond there, the rest of Latin America. So basically, so what you have is the situation where as capital went global, capitalists from the United States linked up with capitalists from Europe and linked us with capitalists from Asia and capitalists from Latin America. Gradually, they began to integrate into a single, globalized capitalist class, which I call the transnational capitalist class. And they're at the apex of the whole global economy of society. That's the real power structure worldwide, this transnational capitalist class.
And this is the TCC that
Exactly.
you talk about.
They abbreviate it as the TCC.
Professor Peter Phillips in his book Giants, he refers to your terminology, the TCC, as well.
Exactly. And Professor Peter Phillips has done a remarkable job in this, actually documenting and with a wealth of data how a tiny handful of global corporations run by the transnational capitalist class. The transnational capitalist class is the owners and the managers of the giant transnational corporations that drive the global economy and exercise real power over states and over the masses of people. So going back to the story, what happens with globalization and the rise of these global corporations and the transnational capitalist class is that they can now pit one state against another, one working class against another. So I was mentioning in the United States, the transnational capitalist class says, well, you know, if you don't accept lower wages and if the US government doesn't deregulate and so forth, we'll just go elsewhere. So all countries, and because what we have is a completely globally integrated production, financial, and service system. So all countries are integrated into the system. We'll get to the coronavirus because this is all related. But what happens is that every country in the world is now dependent on these corporations and every population in the world. And so states do everything they can to try and attract transnationally mobile capital, transnationally mobile investors. And so that means that one state will say, well, look, come here and invest here. We're going to make trade unions illegal. We have a dictatorship, so we can repress workers and poor people and peasants if they complain. We're going to remove environmental regulations. We're going to give you a tax-free bonanza to come and invest. Then another state says, no, we'll give you even a better deal and a better deal and so forth. So so just to conclude the point, transnational capital undermines the ability of states that we referred to earlier to intervene in the economy to redistribute wealth downward. And also, this transnationally mobile capital makes it more difficult for working classes in each country to confront capital. And that's why you have this spiral out of control of global inequalities. And that's why you have a point where 1% has over 50% of the world's wealth and 20% has 95% of the world's wealth.
So, and then in some cases, the countries actually resist some of these things, and then that's when you get maybe they try to do like a regime change, right?
Exactly. So what does, to continue analyzing at the level of global capitalism and the transnational capitalist class and corporations, what do they need? They need every single country around the world to be open to this investment and this plunder, and to create the perfect conditions, the conditions which capital wants to be able to accumulate around the whole world, turn the whole world into a playground for its accumulation of capital. And if any country or any government in a particular country impedes that program of the complete freedom of capital, the complete freedom of the transnational corporations, that government needs to be removed. It needs to be overthrown, or it needs to be shaken up. And that is where, particularly the US state, but the powerful states and the big powerful transnational institutions and agencies steps in. Whether it's for regime change, whether it's to impose sanctions, whether it's to pressure through structural financial pressures for these governments to not impede the free profit making of corporations all around the world.
It seems like there's a coordination with the media, at least in the United States, when it's on the agenda to remove one of these leaders like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or Iran.
Evo Morales in Bolivia.
Yeah, right. And how is it that the media is always coordinated with these efforts? Because just based on logic and reason, like you said, there are dictators and brutal warlords that these companies do business with, and we're not calling for regime changes on those people. So we know that it's not on some moral grounds that the media tells us, oh, this guy's a really bad guy, so we have to remove him, because there's bad guys that we do business with, like Saudi Arabia, for example, or the warlords of the Congo or somebody like
Not just do business with. That's an ideal arrangement for transnational corporations to have a Saudi Arabia regime, a Saudi regime, for instance. But we want to remember that there's always this enormous gulf between how an existing system, an existing class, an existing government legitimates itself and what it actually does. So the US state legitimates itself by saying we represent freedom and democracy around the world. But there's no correlation between that discourse that legitimates the US state and what the US state actually does. The sad history is that the US state has always promoted dictatorships and authoritarian regimes because they're the most effective for representing the interests of what previously were US capitalists, now global capitalists, has always overthrown any attempt by the popular masses to transform their system to meet their own needs. There's absolutely nothing new about this. So U.S. foreign policy has really nothing to do with freedom, nothing to do with democracy. There was a brief period in the late 20th century, I published basically the first major study on this, in which the U.S. states began to promote what it called democracy, to remove the dictatorships that it had already placed in power, right, from previous foreign policy operations, and to put in power civilian elites, to sort of take the steam out of these mass democratization movements in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. But that's over now, once again, and what's happening, speaking about that, as this crisis deepens, the crisis of global capitalism, that a majority of the world's population can no longer even hope to survive in this global capitalist system, and they increasingly see this system as not legitimate and are breaking free of the hegemony, the ideological, the cultural hegemony of this system. And so that represents a very grave threat to the ruling groups worldwide, when masses no longer consider those ruling groups and their system legitimate. And so that's leading to if you take those two dimensions of the crisis, we see two responses worldwide to the crisis. One is popular rebellion from below. All over the world, masses are rising up and challenging the system and calling for fundamental change in the interests of that working and poor majority. And on the other hand, you have this, you want a left-wing or progressive response to the crisis. On the other hand, you have a far-right response to the crisis, which is leaning towards what I call 21st century fascism, the return of authoritarian regimes, of dictatorships, and even fascist projects. And what more of an example do you want than the United States? Now, I'm not saying that in 2020 we are in a fascist system, but what we see is a very quick accumulation of fascist forces in civil society, and they have their representative in the state in the form of Trump and the Trump regime. But you see this worldwide. You see in Western Europe right now, and Eastern Europe, throughout Europe, you see the rise of the resurgence of fascist and neo-fascist forces, including Nazis and the far-right, extreme right parties and authoritarian parties. You see in Latin America far-right takeover. And so these are the two responses to the crisis, right? The popular rebellion from below, and this far-right authoritarian and even neo-fascist response. So that's the political polarization that we're seeing in 2020, and it's a very dangerous time. And it's regrettable to see that really even the far-right response is gaining more ground than the left popular response from below.
Now, it seems like the political situation has a complexity to it in the United States, at least, where you have this sort of like progressive left, like a Bernie Sanders type movement that that is trying to put some checks and balances on the transnational corporate class, like you're talking about. And then you have sort of like this, maybe what Joe Biden perhaps, or some of the, what we label centrists, but they're really kind of like representatives of that class in the sense that they take the donation money and they enact the policies, and you've got like Pelosi and Schumer and Schiff and those guys. They seem to kind of fall in line with that. And then you have, like, on this other side, the Trumpians will point to that and say, we'll see how corrupt they are because they took all the money from the TCC guys and yada yada. And then they view Trump as an outsider in a sense that's gonna kind of save us from that. I know a lot of people who think that right. Trump is challenging that, and that's why they're doing right. this impeachment thing,
right.
because and so it gets a little complicated, and people start conflating things, because I don't see Trump necessarily as being a challenge to that, but more of like his own version of it, perhaps.
Exactly. I mean, it seems confusing, but it's not really that confusing. And I think a lot of this can be explained, again, by the crisis of state legitimacy caused by that's the political dimension of the crisis of capitalism. But let's start with Trump and what he's actually done. Well, first of all, he himself is a member of the transnational capitalist class, and his interests lie in promoting global capitalism and promoting the interests of his class. And he has done that. That's why we need to separate rhetoric from actual policy, what people actually do and not what they say. I can tell you, look, I'm a wonderful person and I'm generous to the whole world. Okay, that's meaningless. You have to see what I actually do in the world, and if what I do in the world makes me a wonderful person or not, right? So we forget we have to do that also with states and governments when they speak. What has Trump done? He has pursued this course of capitalist globalization and the liberation of capital and what we call neoliberalism, the program of this liberating capital from any constraints, we call that neoliberalism. Privatizations, deregulation, trade liberalization, free trade deals, social austerity, cuts in social welfare, all of that is neoliberalism. And Trump represents a policy of neoliberalism on steroids. On steroids. He's vastly accelerated the process of deregulation. He's vastly accelerating the process of privatization. We mean privatization is turning over what's public lands, public services, public education, public health care, whatever it is, turning that into private for-profit and turning it over to corporations. So he's accelerating the charter schools that Obama really started deepening. He's already, you would imagine that the U.S. military and the military operations around the world are public. They're not. The vast majority of the Pentagon budget is turned over to private mercenaries, private corporations. I mean, it's all war and conflict and repression are all privatized. But going back to Trump, so Trump represents this neoliberalism on steroids, where accelerating privatization, accelerating deregulation, accelerating the challenge to workers, union busting and downward pressure on wages. And he just passed, for instance, a tax bill which is unbelievably regressive. It means the rich and corporations pay much less taxes and poor and workers actually pay more in the long run. And so all of this is not in the least bit a threat to the interests of transnational capital. And the transnational capitalist class is 100% behind him. They're delighted. They're delighted. And that's why all of the Democrats and Republicans joined forces to vote for that tax bill, for instance, in the United States. So the tensions come from elsewhere. And let me analyze that. Why is there tensions? But let me just backtrack to say,
sure,
those that control the Democratic Party in the United States and those that control the Republican Party might have slightly different agendas, but they both represent simply two perspectives on global capitalism, and they are both agents of the transnational capitalist class. And all of their financing for their campaigns and putting them back in power is basically the corporations. And Bernie Sanders is the billionaire class, but corporations, Wall Street, the banks, etc.
What Bernie calls the billionaire class, that's what he calls them,
right,
colloquially. But so so essentially, the Democratic establishment and the Republican Party that it is now under Trump are essentially kind of like their foundations are both in the transnational corporate class, and they just have a little bit of differences in how they perspective on how to move.
Well, let's analyze this, right. So I'm saying some things which obviously I'm simplifying. Every time we talk about a complex global reality, we have to simplify. Right. But there's other things. The Democratic Party and all of its candidates and its personnel, they need to constantly get reelected, so they need to present themselves with some legitimating discourse and make some concessions. And historically, the Democratic Party made concessions to labor, a privileged sector of the working class, privileged, disproportionately white, those that had stable employment, disproportionately male. And so the Democratic Party has to do something for its electoral base or it's in trouble, and the Republicans as well. But let's look at something critically important here. We have to go back to the crisis of legitimacy, meaning that a majority of people see this system increasingly as illegitimate. Now let's analyze something else which is critically important to understand what's going on in the United States right now, as we speak, and even as these elections are unfolding. And that is that in the post-World War II boom, workers and regular people in the United States, also in other parts of the world, especially in the United States, experienced rising standards of living, the so-called American dream, okay? And improved employment opportunities and access to higher education, mass higher education. So people were becoming secure and more prosperous post-World War II, the late 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. And now these privileged sectors of the working class worldwide, in the United States, again, disproportionately male, disproportionately white, are experiencing downward mobility, not upward mobility. Why? We've analyzed that already, because capital went global to undermine the power of workers and to increasingly monopolize wealth and accumulate capital worldwide without restrictions.
It's like the NAFTA thing and TPP.
All of that,
yeah.
all of that. Mm-hmm. So this privileged sectors of the U.S. working class are experiencing now socioeconomic destabilization, increasing social crisis, increasing insecurity, uncertain future, and downward mobility and precarious labor. And so this sector is now seeing the system as illegitimate. And how does this sector come to understand where the threat to its existence and its status is coming from? Do they see it as capitalism, the transnational capitalist class, and therefore align with immigrant workers, with blacks and Latinos, with workers and poor people struggling around the world? Or do they identify that their interest with a right-wing nationalism, with some scapegoat, with blaming immigrants, with racism? And so Trump comes along. So it's who gives this group its message? Trump comes along as a demagogue, representing the interests of transnational capital, but also representing a political project of authoritarianism and really neo-fascism, right? And starts mobilizing this sector and channeling its anxiety, mass social anxiety over this crisis, channeling it towards scapegoats, towards a whipping up white nationalist sentiment, towards scapegoating immigrants, towards scapegoating and channeling that mass discontent, which could be explosive and threatening to the system, towards a right-wing fascist project founded on racism, on intensified militarization, and so forth. And so Trump represents that strategy for how a sector of the ruling class responds to the crisis of legitimacy by scapegoating and fascist mobilization. It's exactly what happened in Germany in the 1930s and elsewhere. Right? Germany in the 1930s, a deep crisis for poor and working people, and the Nazis mobilized all of that into a fascist project.
So essentially, when people are desperate and their economic situation is plummeting and they don't see any hope for the future, they start to look towards extremist, fascist.
Well, that also depends on the subjective response, because they could look towards a project of redistributing wealth downward and democratic socialism,
Which is a Bernie Sanders movement.
Precisely.
So that's why you got a split there. You got some people going in that
Exactly.
direction, some people going towards Trump.
Exactly.
And it's a populist movement on both sides. It's just one has more tendencies towards racism and fascism, and the other has more tendencies towards democracy and equality.
And redistribution of wealth, right, exactly, and popular empowerment, precisely.
Okay, gotcha.
Precisely. And that's why it's no wonder then that if you look at 2016, the social base of the Sanders campaign when it was insurgent in 2016 and of the Trump campaign was the same social base. Right? The same social places, these significant sectors of the population that have been displaced, made precarious, right? Experiencing downward mobility. And so even the message is similar. I mean, but Trump has a very different program.
Right.
But
I knew a lot of people who voted for Bernie Sanders and supported him up to the point that the DNC appeared to take the nomination from him in 2016 with the superdelegates and
Exactly.
the whole Clinton campaign being
then
tied
they went
to
in
the
and
DNC.
voted for Trump.
They turned and voted for Trump,
Exactly.
yes.
But why? Now we have the answer. Because both of them are sending a message saying, we're going to resolve the problem, the crisis that neoliberalism has caused, which is why, why the Democrats are just as much to blame for Trump and the rise of fascism, or even more to blame. They set the base. But as we speak, because today is the 11th of March of 2020, and just last night it became more and more inevitable, not 100%, but that Bernie will not be the candidate for the Democrats, and Joe Biden will. And Joe Biden already announced his cabinet and a bunch of his proposals. And his cabinet, he said right away, the CEO of Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Stanley, and the CEO of Citibank are going to be the two key economic cabinet members.
Didn't he announce Jamie Dimon as well?
And Jamie Dimon.
Yeah.
And when you interview...
And Bloomberg, I think,
and
too, right?
Bloomberg,
Yeah.
exactly. So he's bringing in the direct representatives of Wall Street and Silicon Valley and the transnational capitalist class, putting them right back in control of this neoliberal capitalist globalization, which has gotten us into this mess to begin with.
So this is only going to increase the problem. So even if we got Joe Biden for 4 years, then we're likely to get something even worse than Trump, because it's only going to cause even more
displacement, more inequality, more insecurity, and then that's going to push people even more towards a fascist message, even if Trump goes away and someone else comes to replace him 4 years later or 8 years later. That's if Biden can even win with that message.
It's very concerning, because I felt like for a moment there, Bernie Sanders was going to represent sort of our last vestiges of hope that we're going to, get a leash on this transnational corporate class, and that we're going to start redistributing things, and we're going to move in the right direction. And yesterday, it was and last night it was like those hopes started to sink. And I know there's still, you know, if somehow he can turn the tide, there's still like more than half the country hasn't voted yet, you know, and there's still a lot of primary left to go, even though the momentum looks to be in Biden's favor. So I shouldn't call it for Biden yet. But I mean, what can we do? You know, is Bernie Sanders our only, like, is that the only, you know, if we had our eggs in a basket, was that the only basket we could put our eggs in? Or is there something else we can do? If Biden wins the presidency, is there something we can do?
Absolutely, yes.
Or excuse me, if he wins the nomination.
Right, sure. Yeah, this is very, well, if he wins the nomination in terms of the elections, there's nothing we can do but either vote for Trump or vote for Biden or sit it out or write in another candidate. But I mean, if Biden wins, there's for this particular round of elections, there's not much of a choice of what we can do in terms of the political electoral system. But I mean, one of the things about the Sanders campaign and beyond is that I think Sanders himself has been clear to say, these are the social movements, right? And this is my campaign. And my campaign is based on these social movements, and the social movements, we're critically aware, need to grow and expand and continue and become more militant and radical, independent of the Bernie Sanders electoral campaign. And so, you know, one of the things that his electoral campaign has done is it's charged up to 2016, and again right now in 2020, charged up social movements, you know, and mass enthusiasm for fundamental change. And so the key thing that we need to do, you know, as activists, as conscious citizens, well, I don't even say citizens because that leaves out those that are not citizens but that are here, as conscious poor and working people, is to make sure that these social movements don't dissipate once Sanders' campaign dissipates, right? And that it continues to expand and mobilize, and also that that these social movements take up the critique of capitalism and the banner of an alternative to capitalism, which in the words of Bernie Sanders is democratic socialism. But you know, I wanted to, it is so crystal clear, I'm not saying anything that others haven't said in the last few weeks, but it is so crystal clear that when Sanders appeared to be winning the primaries in that first round of primaries, that the transnational capitalist class, but the Democratic Party establishment immediately analyzed we had to do everything possible to undermine Bernie Sanders. And that meant that all of the other candidates in the Democratic Party withdrew from the race and came out very publicly in support of Joe Biden. And of course, corporations, transnational capitalist class, tremendously relieved to see Biden suddenly as the comeback kid.
Even the health insurance stocks shot right back up again. Right?
Exactly. And just last night, again, today's the 11th, so it would be 10 March, he announced that if there was a Medicare for All package passed with him being president in the House and in the Senate, he would veto it on his desk.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yes. Yes. So, right. So what we have here is a situation where elites in the Democratic Party are more scared of Bernie Sanders and this insurgency from below than they are of Trump and fascism. And make no mistakes, they will embrace authoritarianism, they will embrace fascism if it's the only alternative to prevent some fundamental change that affects the interests of the transnational capitalist class.
Wow. So, that's tough. So we're kind of in the fight for our lives.
This is the fight of our future, because for two reasons. This is the fight of our lives, absolutely, for three reasons. First, we're facing this existential crisis and the threat of ecological collapse. Right? And that can't be separated from global capitalism at all, because as long as you have a system in which the drive for private profit trumps everything else, you cannot have a transition away from this machine of accumulation. You cannot have a green capitalism. That's an oxymoron.
So within the current system, the way that it's set up, we have to change the system itself in order to even start moving in a direction.
Or it has to be the same thing. In other words, and this is a very hopeful sign, the dramatic worldwide upsurge of environmental justice movement, right? The environmental movement. But so we don't put that on hold, but that environmental justice movement needs to critique capitalism and put forth a strategy which challenges capitalism in order to save the ecology and the biosphere and life on the planet. And it's moving towards that. I mean, slowly, it's moving towards that. There's the, mainstream environmental groups, but this radical upsurge from below is critiquing, the drive to make profit is destroying the...
Yeah, one of the things on the environment, there's so many points actually that you bring up where I see this sort of, the way the media portrays things to try to kind of, I don't know, maybe perhaps create division, but we hear about climate change, and I get that the climate does seem to be changing, but people will say, they get so focused on that, and they don't ever bring up like the massive amount of chemical pollution, for example, which is causing cancer everywhere, or the massive amount of plastic that's in the ocean, or I mean, some of these things get brought up a little bit, but mostly the soundbite is climate change, climate change, climate change. But there's like these specific, it's not just carbon dioxide. There's like, chemical companies in Hawaii that are using Hawaii as a chemical test site to spray pesticides, use experimental pesticides on genetically modified crops, Monsanto, Dow, Bayer, Syngenta, right next to schools and neighborhoods.
Exactly.
And yeah.
And moreover, they say that the environmental crisis is democratic, but it's not really, because all of these dangers, toxic dangers, all of these spills, all of the location of dangerous industries such as chemical industry, the hog industry, all of that is located around poor and working class communities, and in countries like the United States, disproportionately racially oppressed communities because they're the most vulnerable. So it's not a democratic distribution of these incredible hazards, which are causing mass pandemics of cancer and all kinds of disease, autoimmune diseases and so forth. So I mean, it all comes together, and that's why it's an environmental justice movement, because to struggle for the environment is also to struggle for social justice. They cannot be separated, and to do both of those, you have to challenge capital, and it's imperative to endlessly accumulate. So we need a radical new form of human beings producing and reproducing our existence. That is a radical new economy, right? And the economy cannot just be post-capitalist in the sense that it's socialist because we collectively own the factories and the farms and distribute the wealth democratically. That's fine, but it also has to be a very different way of producing our existence, as you pointed out. We go moving beyond plastics, drastically curtailing consumption of luxury goods and expanding consumption of mass goods such as healthcare and education and healthy foods and so forth. But so there's really two dimensions to where we need to go in the future. We have to overthrow capitalism. There's no doubt about that. Capitalism will take down humanity and the planet. Yeah. Okay, but we also need to replace it with a system which is sustainable and which is ecological, which is why many people these days are moving towards calling for in ecological socialism. That's what democratic ecological socialism.
Nice. I like that. The sound of that. However, when you say overthrow capitalism, a lot of people, it triggers them because we've been, our whole lives bombarded with this idea of the alternative to capitalism is communism, and that's going to be like the Soviet Union or China. And I think a lot of times these ideas get conflated where you're taking like an authoritarian regime and conflating it with the alternative and saying the only alternative is authoritarianism and we're all going to, be in bread lines or something.
Right. Well, among the younger generation, increasingly this Cold War anti-communism doesn't have much of an effect. But we do need to be clear that China is not a socialist country. It's just rhetoric. China is also global capitalism on turbines or on steroids. Was the term that I used. China now, it's the majority of the Chinese economy is private Chinese-based and transnational corporations, which have fused together. After the United States, the biggest concentration of billionaires on the planet and millionaires is China. Right. And China is investing all around the world for these extractive industries, which are devastating local communities and sucking up those resources for the private accumulation of capital back in China.
So we call it communist, but it's not like Marx's idea of communism.
Not in the least, not whatsoever. It's the antithesis of Marxism. It's a system which is more and more capitalist, more and more unequal. The inequality and immiseration is spreading like wildfire in China. You have the ironic situation where you have a political system which is totally closed and totally monopolized by a party which calls itself a communist party. But for Marx, communism and socialism is first of all, democratic, and secondly, it's poor and working people collectively organizing their own existence for their collective good, right? Not a party dictatorship, which is simply creating the conditions for private transnational corporate plunder.
Right. Communal. in a sense, communism.
Communal, but work is self-organization and collectively organizing to meet their needs.
So on that thread, it would seem that like some of these industries that you're talking about, whether we look at like, let's say the military industrial complex, for example, if we take military contract companies like Raytheon and Boeing and all the Lockheed and all the various military contract companies, Halliburton, these companies, these military contract companies have an incentive to go to lobby for war because they will make money off of it, and that's how they have to continue to grow their capital.
Absolutely.
So it would seem like the most, I don't know, I'm not a scholar, but the most obvious solution I can think of would be to socialize those companies or to take them out of private, remove their status as a private company, right, and stop the profit motive, because it's the profit motive that drives them to keep doing this, right?
Yes. So you've touched on one of the nerve points of where we are at in 2020. So I have been researching and writing about for the last few years what I call the global police state. And actually I have my conclusion of all of my research is coming out in a book titled The Global Police State. It will be out in just a few months in June. But so what we see is three things by a global police state. The first thing I mean by global police state is first the repressive dimension. When you have 1% of humanity controlling more than 50% of the world's wealth, and 80% of humanity has only 5% of the world's wealth. That 80% is going to rebel. And it is rebelling. And so that 80% needs to be repressed. And so you have these complex new systems of transnational social control, of repression and of war and counterinsurgency against the world's poor and working class people, right? And so that's the first dimension of global police state. And we discussed that. It's leading to political systems which are neo-fascist and authoritarian. It's leading to police states, to cities, the cities being divided, to gentrification, to, everything we associate with a police state is becoming completely globalized. Systems of mass incarceration to lock up surplus labor, border walls, wars against immigrants, and so forth.
So when Trump increases the U.S. military budget from like 600-ish billion to 700-ish billion, and then Pelosi and Schumer and all those guys vote for it, they're all in lockstep with this.
100%. So the second dimension of global police state is, remember, the first dimension is the need that this system has to expand systems of repression and social control, given inequalities and marginality and surplus humanity, right? The second dimension of global police state is that conducting warfare, undertaking repression and social control is wildly profitable. And so it's not just the military-industrial complex. We want to see it much bigger than that. Every time there's a flare-up in the Middle East, Raytheon's stock value goes up because the U.S. pays Raytheon to give them missiles, cruise missiles, for instance, which Raytheon produces. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, all of them. A significant portion of their profits for Raytheon, I think it's nearly 100%, requires war and requires repression and requires conflict. So you might say, what a horrible thing to have this endless conflict in the Middle East. For the military-industrial complex, it's nothing horrible, it's wonderful, and they need to perpetuate it. But it is not just that. You can't separate the military-industrial complex from the Wall Street Silicon Valley nexus. So all of this increased repression worldwide and profit-making through repression, through war, involves a new round of technological revolution led by a new round of digitalization headquartered in Silicon Valley. And all the big tech companies which now are at the center of the global economy, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and the other few, biggest tech companies which are at the very heart now of the global economy, are so intertwined in the technology which they provide, are so intertwined with the military-industrial complex that you can't separate it out. The CIA, the Pentagon are incredibly big contractors with Google, with Apple, with Microsoft.
Doesn't Amazon store a bunch of data for the CIA?
Absolutely, and Jeff Bezos is on a CIA board of consultants.
And he also owns the Washington Post. That's interesting.
That's the media connection you were mentioning previously.
Yeah.
And then you have to get Wall Street or the global banks and financial system in on the picture because they finance it all. So you have, but then there's much more than that as well.
There's coordination between finance, military contract companies, tech companies,
Exactly.
and media.
But more than coordination, they are invested. So the Wall Street banks own portions of Boeing and Raytheon and own portions of Microsoft. That's why I'm saying the transnational capitalist class, you have these capitalists from individual sectors or individual countries, but they cross-invest, they sit on each other's boards, they feed off of each other. So that's what they're so, I mean, you really can't say they're collaborating. They really become this mass of globalized capital with an investment in the global police state just to make profit. So the war on drugs, so-called war on drugs, is wildly profitable on the one hand. There's hundreds of billions of dollars to be made over the years and going into the future. And on the same hand, the war on drugs legitimates the locking up and mass incarceration in the United States, legitimates the repression of communities in Mexico and in Central and South America. And so you get a coming together of the political need to repress the world's population with the economic need to turn warfare, repression, social control, Pentagon budgets, militarization, that driving forward profit making. And they come together, the political and the economic, around this crisis.
So then the crisis seems to be driven by this profit incentive that these companies have, right? So when we're talking about solutions, is part of the solution to when a company gets too big, do we just say, you know what, like you can't be a private corporation anymore because you're driving our politics. Your profit incentive is driving our politics and our foreign policy, even forcing us to go to war just to make more money for you. We have to remove your profit incentive. Now we're going to make this a public utility.
Well, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, precisely. There was a 2007, 2008 financial collapse. And that was a time when if we had a state, because the government represents the interests of capital, but if we had a state representing the interests of the majority in the United States, those banks would have been nationalized. Instead, they got a bailout to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Exactly. And now the giant tech companies need to be turned into public utilities. And doing that is in the interest of the vast majority of the poor and the working class. But that undermines the deepest interests of the transnational capitalist class. So this does come back to class struggle. This does come back to social struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's not going to be voluntary. The Wall Street banks are not going to say, sure, turn us into a public financial institution, we'll be happy.
Or sure, we'll try to limit our profits and just bring our profit margins down. Nobody's ever said that, right?
Not only have they not said that, but they can't, because that's the nature of capitalism. Capital has to accumulate and maximize profit.
Yes.
If their profits get undermined, they stop investing and you move into stagnation.
Yeah, I've heard that they have a fiduciary and even a legal responsibility to their shareholders to do whatever it is possible to maximize their profit.
It's built into the system.
Yeah. Wow. So one of the problems politically when we bring up this idea of making companies into a public utility, for example, people think that the government's going to take over their small business or their jobs or their lives, and can we have like kind of a mixture of both, where the really big things are public utilities, and then everyone has their
sure.
freedom.
Socialism doesn't mean that you take over mom and pop stores whatsoever, or small scale, private operations or whatsoever. It doesn't mean that in the least. And in fact, small scale entrepreneurs, whether you own a mom and pop store, whatever it is that you're doing, are actually also exploited by global capital, completely exploited. Do you know how many? I don't have the figure in front of me, but is it tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of businesses, small businesses, go bust every single year. People that, life savings to launch a taqueria. Taqueria is where you sell tacos, right? Mm-hmm. We have a lot of that here in California. And 3 months later, 4 months later, they go out of business because everything that you need to run that business, you have to rent a place. All of the machinery, you got machineries made by global corporations. You're financing from the bank. The financial system has to give you your financing and you have to pay it back. Then if you have a taqueria, you're not making growing your own corn. The corn is controlled by Syngenta and by Monsanto and those that control Cargill, those that control the global corn trade and everything you put into your tacos and so forth and so on. So small businesses are completely dependent on global corporations which which exploit and extract all of the wealth that those small businesses produce. So really, what we would be looking at in a democratic socialism is certainly what you refer to as what we call a mixed economy, meaning that there are big public utilities and big public enterprises, which are owned by the state, but meaning that we all own it together. And then there's cooperatives. Workers' cooperatives is a second form of property in which there's 100 workers, maybe in a tortilla factory, and they own it collectively and make the decisions collectively. And then there's small scale private enterprises, mom and pop shops, and so forth. Socialists have always called for that type of mixed economy. What is expropriated and done away with is global capital, the giant transnational corporations.
And so that sounds like a good plan. I'm thinking again of like some of the rhetoric that people will
Okay, well, let's talk about hegemony and ideology. Because remember,
cool.
I mentioned at the beginning it's a crisis of legitimacy and hegemony of the system, but we're not there yet where this dominant hegemony is fully overturned. So any social order, right, it rules by two mechanisms. One is direct coercion. In other words, you challenge the system, you're going to be thrown in jail for mass incarceration. You go out and strike, you try and take over Microsoft and turn it into a public utility. Or if you're homeless and you enter into the house of a landlord, right, even though the house could be empty, police will come and put you in jail. So you have direct repression all throughout the system. We call it coercive domination. Then you have the second mechanism of social control, and that's ideological hegemony, what we call consensual domination, meaning the masses of people have internalized basically the propaganda that the system puts out.
Yes.
The way the system legitimates itself with its ideology and its propaganda and its discourses. And that becomes dominant. Why? Because the media itself is itself corporate media.
Okay, so how does all this figure into with this coronavirus now coming in and sort of shutting down aspects of the global economy and crashing the stock market?
Sure. So the coronavirus is just the trigger for this recession that we're falling into now and that might get much, much worse. It simply pulled back the veils of the global economy and shown how incredibly, number one, how incredibly interdependent all countries and all peoples and all regions are to each other through the globalized economy. So the coronavirus stopped momentarily the supply chains. All of these supplies go from China all the way to the rest of the world, and so it starts undermining the whole global economy. But the other thing about the coronavirus is that we had analyzed earlier the structural crisis of overaccumulation. And so how has the system continued to function from 2008, even before then, right up until 2020? It's had a number of mechanisms to, if you want, push forward into the future the day of reckoning, the day when this whole thing collapses. One of those mechanisms has been, we already discussed, military spending and conflicts and war. That means the capital keeps on accumulating even when masses of people cannot consume. I can't go out and buy a missile, but Raytheon drops a missile in Syria and then the US government pays it for another missile. So we have militarized accumulation, right, to offset the crisis, the collapse of this system. Another mechanism that we have is that transnational corporations and their political representatives continue to plunder the state. So increasingly the public finance system in the United States goes to give money to the wealthy and take it away from the poor, such as regressive taxation. But the third big mechanism, and this is going to touch into the coronavirus, the third big mechanism that's kept this economy going rather than collapsing all of these years is financial speculation. And to give those listening to this documentary an idea, the whole global economy produces $75 trillion a year in goods and services. The shirt I'm wearing, the cars that we drive, the food that we eat, the houses that are built, right, the schools that we go to, all of that is $75 trillion a year, the whole world. Now, financial speculation just in derivatives. Derivative means that's already a speculative transaction. A derivative is something speculative, is $1.2 quadrillion. So we have the real economy of goods and services that we consume over here, and we have over 1.75 trillion, over 10, 11, 12 times bigger is just financial speculation, not representing anything but a global casino. And so that financial speculation has also prevented the global economy from collapsing. Militarized accumulation, right? Wars, financial speculation, plundering state finance. But so that structural crisis is deepening of overaccumulation. The coronavirus merely is the trigger. It's merely the final trigger. Just like in 2008, the collapse, the final trigger was the subprime mortgage crisis. But that was the trigger then. So all you need is something to come along and trigger it. And so the coronavirus is showing just how incredibly fragile and crisis-ridden is global capitalism and this global economy.
Wow. So we need to be activated and continue to organize.
Well, absolutely. That's our only salvation. But we also need to, and I've been saying this for many years now, and not just myself, because you see in upsurge, you see people taking the streets in Lebanon, you see it in Iraq, you see it in China, you see it throughout Latin America, all over the world. People are here in the United States, people are rising up in mass social movements and movements that are protesting governments and becoming more and more conscious that the problem is the system itself. But we need two things for these movements to really take off. One, they need to be transnationally coordinated, because any single one country and movements there cannot change the system, because the system is global. And so we don't have those mechanisms for transnational coordination. For instance, there's a mass uprising in Lebanon. How can we connect that to uprisings elsewhere? How can these different movements, in different countries connect to some transnational project? And that's the second thing we need. We need a vision and a project for the future that we all unite around. So for instance, you have the Bernie Sanders basic program in the United States, but we need a global basic program. So they rise up in Lebanon, given the specific circumstances of that country, but that uprising is linked to some transnational project of change. Like a 10-point program of change. The banks should be nationalized all over. International financial transactions should be taxed. That used to be called the Tobin tax idea. That there's a program around
Getting
which
money out of politics.
getting money out of politics. A reversal of the privatization of healthcare and educational systems, some 10-point program that all these mass social movements around the world can agree upon and struggle together around. I think those are two things that are critically important.
Okay. We'll keep working on that.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Sure, my
Excellent
pleasure.
information.